investigators stunned when a quiet Detroit suburb becomes the scene of one of the most haunting holiday killings in American history, where a loving couple's festive celebration turned into a bloodbath that would take over 4 decades to solve. December 25th, 1980. Morning light struggled through heavy Michigan snow clouds as Officer Patricia Mendoza pulled her patrol car onto Maple Ridge Drive in the small town of Havenbrook, just 40 minutes outside Detroit. A neighbor had called dispatch at 7:23 a.m., voice trembling, reporting that something felt wrong at the Reeves house. The Christmas lights were still blazing despite daylight breaking across frozen lawns, and the front door stood partially open, cold wind pushing it back and forth like a slow, deliberate warning. Before we dive into this story, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. Mendoza approached cautiously, her boots crunching through 6 inches of fresh snow that had fallen overnight. She called out, identified herself, heard nothing but the faint sound of a record player stuck on repeat inside the house, scratching the same 2 seconds of Silent Night over and over again. When she stepped through that door, weapon drawn, she found Michael and Linda Reeves sprawled across their living room floor, positioned in ways that made no anatomical sense, unless someone had arranged them that way. Blood had soaked into the cream-colored carpet beneath the Christmas tree, ornaments still twinkling above them like nothing had gone wrong, like this was just another peaceful holiday morning in small-town Michigan. But then the details emerged, and nothing about this scene suggested peace. Michael Reeves, 42 years old, lay face down near the fireplace, his right arm extended toward the mantel where family photos smiled down at him. 3 stab wounds punctured his back, each one precise, calculated, delivered by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Linda Reeves, 39, was found near the sofa, her body positioned on its side, one hand clutching a torn piece of fabric that investigators would later determine came from a work jacket. She had defensive wounds across both palms, deep cuts that told a story of desperation, of fighting against someone she might have recognized, someone she never expected to hurt her. The medical examiner would later estimate time of death between 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve and 2 a.m. on Christmas morning, right in that window when most families were either wrapping last-minute gifts or fast asleep, dreaming of the morning ahead. But the Reeves family never made it to Christmas morning. Not really. Because whatever happened in those hours erased any future they might have built together. Detective Raymond Krause arrived at 8:47 a.m., a man who had worked homicides for 16 years and thought he had seen every variation of human cruelty Michigan winters could produce. He stood in that living room, staring at the scene, trying to piece together what kind of person could do this on Christmas Eve. The house showed no signs of forced entry, no windows shattered, no locks jimmied, no doors kicked in. Whoever killed Michael and Linda Reeves had either been let inside willingly, or they had a key, or they possessed skills that left no trace of their intrusion. But then came the contradictions that would haunt this case for decades. Wrapped presents sat undisturbed beneath the tree. A diamond necklace lay on the dining room table, still in its velvet box, worth roughly $4,000 in 1980 money. Michael's wallet rested on the kitchen counter, containing $237 in cash. Linda's purse hung on its usual hook by the back door, credit cards and jewelry inside untouched. If this was a robbery, the perpetrator had the strangest priorities imaginable, because the only item missing from the entire house was Linda's wedding ring, a modest gold band with a small sapphire stone that Michael had saved 3 months to afford when they got married in 1962. Why take a ring worth maybe $300 and leave behind thousands in easily accessible valuables? That question would circle through investigative reports for years, never finding a satisfactory answer, always leading detectives down paths that ended in frustration and dead ends. The crime scene photos told another puzzling story. Blood spatter analysis, still a relatively new field in 1980, suggested that Michael had been attacked first near the fireplace, where he had been adding logs to keep the house warm through the night. He had turned, confronted his attacker, and according to the positioning of his body and the blood patterns on the walls, he had fought back with everything he had. Furniture was overturned in that corner of the room, a lamp shattered, the fireplace poker bent at an odd angle as if someone had tried to use it as a weapon. Linda had been in the kitchen when she heard the commotion. Investigators found a broken coffee mug near the sink, still containing cold liquid, suggesting she had dropped it, and rushed toward the living room. She made it approximately 15 feet before the attacker intercepted her. The defensive wounds on her hands indicated she had grabbed at the weapon, tried to wrestle it away, but whoever held that knife possessed strength and determination that overpowered her completely. But then there was the blood on the windowsill. Crime scene technician Marcus Webb, a meticulous man who photographed every inch of that house, noticed a single drop of blood on the inside edge of the living room window, the one that faced the backyard. He swabbed it carefully, labeled it Evidence Item 47B, and sent it to the Michigan State Police Lab in Lansing for analysis. The report came back 3 weeks later. Type O positive blood, matching neither Michael nor Linda, who were both Type A. This blood belonged to the killer, or possibly an accomplice, someone who had cut themselves during the attack or while moving through the house. In 1980, that was the extent of what science could tell investigators. No DNA profiling existed yet. No genetic markers that could identify a specific individual from a microscopic sample. The blood type narrowed the suspect pool to roughly 42% of the American population, which meant it was essentially useless as a tool for exclusion or confirmation. Detective Krause filed it away, hoping that someday technology might catch up to his need for answers. The investigation exploded across Havenbrook like a grenade in the days following Christmas. This was a town of 8,000 people, where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked and children rode bikes until streetlights came on. The idea that a brutal double murder could happen here, on the holiest night of the year, shattered whatever sense of safety residents had built over generations of quiet living. But then the theories started multiplying, each one more bizarre than the last. Some neighbors whispered about a drifter who had been seen near the truck stop on Highway 23, a man with hollow eyes who asked about work and disappeared after Christmas. Police investigated, found nothing concrete, no identification, no witnesses who could provide useful descriptions beyond tall and wearing a dark coat, which described roughly half the male population during Michigan winter. Others pointed fingers at David Chen, a former colleague of Michael's who had been laid off from the automotive plant 6 months earlier. Chen had reportedly made threats, said things in anger about management ruining his life. But when detectives questioned him, his alibi was airtight. He had been in Ohio visiting his sister's family, with dozens of witnesses and receipts from gas stations along the route, proving his whereabouts on Christmas Eve. The investigation needed to go backward, needed to understand who Michael and Linda Reeves actually were, because sometimes the key to solving a murder lies in the victim's past, in relationships that soured, or debts that went unpaid, or secrets that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. Michael Reeves grew up in Grand Rapids, the second of 4 children born to a factory worker and a school librarian. He was unremarkable in the best possible way, a B student who played baseball in summer and helped his father fix cars in their garage on weekends. After high school, he took a job at the Willow Run automotive plant, starting on the assembly line and working his way up to shift supervisor over 15 years of steady, reliable work. Co-workers described him as fair-minded, someone who remembered birthdays and never raised his voice, even when production quotas fell short. Linda Morrison met Michael at a church social in 1961. She had moved to Michigan from Indiana 2 years earlier, taking a secretarial position at a law firm in downtown Detroit. Friends remembered her as reserved but warm, someone who collected recipe cards and volunteered at the public library on Saturday mornings. She and Michael dated for 11 months before he proposed, presenting her with that modest sapphire ring during a picnic at Belle Isle Park. They married in June 1962, bought their house on Maple Ridge Drive 3 years later, and settled into the kind of quiet, predictable life that most people dream about. No children came, though not for lack of trying. Linda suffered 3 miscarriages between 1964 and 1968, each one leaving deeper scars than the last. By 1970, they had stopped talking about starting a family, pouring their energy instead into their home, their garden, and each other. But then came the question that Detective Krause kept circling back to. Who would want to destroy such ordinary, inoffensive people? The deeper investigators dug, the less sense any of it made. Michael had no gambling debts, no secret vices, no extramarital affairs that might explain a crime of passion. Linda's life was equally transparent, her days divided between work at the law firm and evenings at home. They attended First Presbyterian Church most Sundays, hosted occasional dinner parties for neighbors, and took one modest vacation each year, usually to the Upper Peninsula, where they rented a cabin and spent a week fishing and reading. Their bank accounts showed steady savings, nothing extravagant but comfortable enough. No large withdrawals, no suspicious deposits, no evidence of blackmail or extortion. Their phone records revealed calls to family members, co-workers, and local businesses, nothing that raised red flags or suggested hidden connections to dangerous people. Detective Krause interviewed 47 people in the first month alone. Neighbors, co-workers, distant relatives, members of their church congregation, even the mailman who delivered to Maple Ridge Drive. Everyone told the same story. Michael and Linda were good people, kind people, the type you could count on to water your plants when you went on vacation or bring over a casserole when someone got sick. But then someone suggested looking into Linda's past, before Michigan, before Michael, before the life she had built in Havenbrook. Linda Morrison had grown up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, the only child of Harold and Dorothy Morrison. Her father worked as an insurance adjuster, her mother as a seamstress who took in alterations to supplement the family income. Linda had been an excellent student, graduating third in her high school class. But college was never discussed. Money was tight, and in 1956, girls from families like hers were expected to find secretarial work or get married, preferably both. She worked for 2 years at a small accounting firm in Fort Wayne before making the move to Michigan in 1959. When Detective Krause contacted the Fort Wayne police to inquire about Linda's time there, he stumbled upon something unexpected. Linda Morrison had filed a restraining order in April 1959 against a man named Thomas Whitaker, a co-worker at the accounting firm who had become obsessed with her. According to the police report, Whitaker had asked Linda out repeatedly over the course of 6 months. She declined each time, politely at first, then firmly, then desperately, as his behavior escalated. He started showing up at her apartment unannounced, leaving gifts on her doorstep, following her home from work. The final straw came when Linda found him sitting in his car outside her church one Sunday morning, watching her through binoculars. The restraining order was granted, and Linda Morrison left Fort Wayne 3 weeks later, moving to Michigan and never looking back. Thomas Whitaker, according to Fort Wayne police records, remained in Indiana for another year before disappearing from public record entirely. No forwarding address, no employment history, nothing to indicate where he had gone or what he had done with his life after 1960. Detective Krause felt electricity run through him when he read that report. He immediately put out inquiries, searching for any trace of Thomas Whitaker in Michigan, particularly in the Detroit area, particularly anywhere near Havenbrook. But then the trail went completely cold. Whitaker had no driver's license on file in Michigan, no property records, no utility bills, no paper trail whatsoever. If he had followed Linda to Michigan, he had done so while remaining completely invisible to official records, which seemed nearly impossible in the bureaucratic landscape of 1980s America. The investigation shifted focus, pouring resources into finding Thomas Whitaker, building a profile of a man who might have carried an obsession for over 20 years, who might have finally acted on Christmas Eve 1980 when he saw lights glowing in the Reeves house and decided that if he couldn't have Linda, nobody could. But then another possibility emerged, one that investigators had initially dismissed as too outlandish to consider seriously. In late January 1981, a woman named Carol Brennan walked into the Havenbrook Police Department carrying a shoebox filled with newspaper clippings about the Reeves murders. She was 46 years old, worked as a nurse at Havenbrook Community Hospital, and lived 6 blocks away from Maple Ridge Drive. She told the desk sergeant that she had information about the killings, information that might sound crazy, but needed to be heard. Detective Krause sat down with her in Interview Room B, a cramped space with cinder-block walls and fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. Carol Brennan looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. Dark circles under her eyes and her hands shaking slightly as she opened the shoebox and began pulling out clippings. She explained that her younger brother, James Brennan, had developed schizophrenia in his early 20s. He had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, and in December 1980, he was living in a supervised group home in Havenbrook, trying to maintain stability with medication and therapy. On Christmas Eve, James had gone missing from the group home for approximately 4 hours, disappearing around 9 p.m. and returning just after 1 a.m. on Christmas morning. The staff at the group home had filed an incident report, but didn't alert police because James had a history of wandering off when he felt overwhelmed, and he always returned eventually. When Carol visited her brother on December 26th, she noticed scratches on his hands and what looked like a small cut on his left wrist. When she asked him about it, James became agitated, talking rapidly about shadows and voices and something terrible that had happened on Christmas Eve. But then Carol showed Detective Krause something that changed the entire investigation. She pulled out a small cloth bag from the shoebox, opened it carefully, and removed a gold ring with a small sapphire stone. She had found it in James's room at the group home when she helped him pack his belongings after he was transferred to a more secure facility in early January. She recognized it immediately from the descriptions in newspaper articles about the Reeves murders. Linda's missing wedding ring. Detective Krause felt his stomach drop. This was the break they needed. Physical evidence connecting a suspect directly to the crime scene. But then Carol Brennan started crying, and she said something that complicated everything. "My brother couldn't have done this alone. James is gentle when he takes his medication. He wouldn't hurt anyone deliberately. But he's easily influenced, easily manipulated. If someone told him to do something, convinced him it was necessary or right, he might follow instructions without understanding what he was really doing. Someone used my brother, detective. Someone turned him into a weapon and pointed him at that house." The investigation exploded in a new direction. If James Brennan had been present at the Reeves house that night, who had brought him there? Who had given him instructions? And why would anyone choose a mentally ill man from a group home to carry out a double murder on Christmas Eve? James Brennan was interviewed extensively over the following weeks, but his statements were inconsistent and fragmented. He talked about a man with a deep voice who picked him up on Christmas Eve, drove him to a house with bright lights, told him they were going to play a game. He remembered going inside, remembered people shouting, remembered blood on his hands. But the timeline was fractured, the details contradictory. One minute he would describe events in vivid detail, the next he would claim it was all a dream, something he saw on television. Forensic psychologists evaluated James and concluded that while he had likely been present at the crime scene, his mental state made it impossible to determine his level of participation or culpability. He might have been an active participant, or he might have been a confused bystander, manipulated by someone else. The scratches on his hands could have come from defensive wounds, or they could have come from climbing through bushes in his confused state. But then the blood evidence provided partial answers. The blood sample from the windowsill, evidence item 47B, was tested against James Brennan's blood type. It matched. James was O positive, same as the unknown sample. This placed him inside the Reeves house during or immediately after the murders. The ring in his possession further confirmed his presence. James Brennan had been there, had witnessed or participated in the killing of Michael and Linda Reeves. But the mystery of the second person remained unsolved. Detectives scoured the group home records, looking for visitors, staff members, anyone who might have had access to James and the ability to manipulate him. They found nothing suspicious. The staff were all licensed professionals with clean backgrounds. Visitors were logged meticulously, and nobody had signed in to see James on Christmas Eve. But then, investigators discovered something troubling in the employment records. A maintenance worker named Robert Hutchins had been employed at the group home from September 1980 through January 1981. He quit without notice on January 3rd, the same day James Brennan was transferred to the secure facility. Hutchins had never undergone a formal background check because he was hired as a temporary contractor, not a permanent employee. When detectives tried to locate him, they found that Robert Hutchins didn't exist. The Social Security number on his employment application belonged to a man who had died in 1975. The address he listed was a vacant lot. The phone number was disconnected. Someone had infiltrated the group home under a false identity, gained access to vulnerable patients, and disappeared the moment the investigation started closing in. Who was this person? Why had he targeted James Brennan specifically? And what connection did he have to Michael and Linda Reeves? The investigation stalled again. Without knowing the true identity of Robert Hutchins, detectives had no way to move forward. They distributed sketches based on descriptions from group home staff, but the drawings were generic enough to match thousands of men in Michigan. Dark hair, medium build, unremarkable features. He was a ghost. Someone who had planned this meticulously and covered his tracks perfectly. Years passed. The case remained open but inactive, filed among dozens of other unsolved homicides that haunted the Havenbrook Police Department. Detective Krause retired in 1987, taking with him a profound sense of failure, knowing he had come so close to solving the Reeves murders but couldn't quite grasp the final pieces. James Brennan died in a psychiatric facility in 1993, taking whatever fragmented memories he possessed to his grave. Carol Brennan continued writing letters to police every December, begging them not to forget her brother. Not to forget that he had been a victim too, used and discarded by someone whose identity remained hidden. But then the world changed, and with it, the tools available to investigators. DNA profiling became standard practice in the 1990s, allowing forensic scientists to create genetic fingerprints from biological evidence. Cold case units formed in police departments across the country, dedicated teams whose sole purpose was revisiting unsolved murders with modern technology. In 2010, Detective Sarah Chen inherited the Reeves case file when she joined the Havenbrook Cold Case Unit, a newly formed division funded by state grants aimed at addressing Michigan's backlog of unsolved homicides. Chen was 34 years old, daughter of immigrants who had built a restaurant business in Detroit. And she approached cold cases with a combination of technological savvy and old-fashioned detective work that her predecessors had never quite mastered. She digitized the entire Reeves file, scanning thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, and crime scene photographs into searchable databases. She cross-referenced names against modern records, looking for connections that 1980s investigators might have missed. And she found evidence item 47B, the blood sample from the windowsill, sitting in a temperature-controlled storage facility in Lansing, waiting patiently for technology to catch up. Chen submitted the sample for DNA analysis in March 2010. The results came back 6 weeks later, confirming what blood type testing had suggested decades earlier. The DNA belonged to James Brennan. But then Chen requested something that hadn't been possible in 1980. She asked the lab to extract DNA from the fabric Linda Reeves had been clutching when she died. The piece of work jacket that had been cataloged as evidence item 23A. The fabric yielded skin cells, microscopic traces of the person who had worn that jacket. When the lab processed those cells and created a DNA profile, they discovered something extraordinary. The DNA didn't match James Brennan. It didn't match anyone in CODIS, the National Criminal Database containing profiles from convicted felons across the United States. This was someone with no criminal record, someone who had committed the perfect crime and walked away clean, never once appearing on law enforcement radar. For 12 years, that DNA profile sat in the system, checked periodically against new entries in CODIS, never finding a match. Detective Chen refused to let the case die, reviewing the file annually, looking for new angles, new technologies that might provide breakthroughs. But then came 2022, and with it, the revolutionary technique that had caught the Golden State Killer: genetic genealogy. This method took DNA from crime scenes and uploaded it to public genealogy databases, places where ordinary people submitted their genetic information to learn about ancestry and find distant relatives. By identifying third cousins or fourth cousins who shared small percentages of DNA with the unknown suspect, investigators could build family trees backward and forward through time, narrowing down possibilities until a specific individual emerged. Detective Chen, now 46 years old and leading the cold case unit, submitted the unknown DNA profile from evidence item 23A to a genetic genealogy service in April 2022. The results came back in June. 14 possible matches, distant relatives ranging from second cousins to fourth cousins, spread across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. Chen assembled a team of genealogists and spent 3 months building family trees, tracing marriages and births and deaths through public records, newspaper archives, church registries, and immigration documents. They constructed a genetic network spanning 5 generations, slowly narrowing the possibilities until one name appeared at the intersection of multiple family lines: Thomas Whitaker, the man who had obsessed over Linda Morrison in 1959, the man who had disappeared from public record in 1960, the man who had apparently never stopped hunting the woman who got away. But then came the challenge of finding him 42 years after the murders. If Thomas Whitaker had survived to 2022, he would be in his mid-80s, possibly living under a different name, possibly dead. Chen and her team searched death records first, hoping to find closure even if justice was no longer possible. They found no death certificate for Thomas Whitaker in any state database. They searched property records, marriage licenses, vehicle registrations, everything that might leave a paper trail for a man living under his real name. Nothing appeared until they started searching employment records from the 1960s and 1970s, specifically construction and maintenance work, the type of jobs where a man could move from place to place without attracting attention. They found a Thomas Whitaker who had worked for various construction companies across the Midwest from 1960 through 1978, moving every few months, never staying in one location long enough to establish roots. His last known employment was with a carpentry contractor in Lansing, Michigan, just 30 miles from Havenbrook, from June 1978 through December 1980. The company had gone out of business in 1982, and the owner had died in 2005, making it impossible to verify details about Whitaker's time there. But then, investigators found something in old tax records, an address where Thomas Whitaker had filed his 1979 taxes, a rooming house in Lansing that had been converted to condominiums in the 1990s. Chen drove to Lansing with 2 other detectives in October 2022, hoping against hope that someone might remember a carpenter who lived there over 40 years earlier. The building was now home to young professionals and graduate students from Michigan State University. The current owner knew nothing about previous tenants. Most residents had moved in within the last 5 years. But then they knocked on the door of Unit 3B, and an elderly woman answered. Margaret Torres was 89 years old. a retired schoolteacher who had bought her condo in 1994 and had lived in Lansing since the 1950s. When detectives showed her a photograph of Thomas Whitaker from his 1959 Fort Wayne driver's license, she studied it carefully and then nodded slowly. I remember him. Quiet man, kept to himself. He lived in this building when it was still a rooming house. I had an apartment across the street back then. He used to sit on the front steps smoking cigarettes, watching people walk by. There was something off about him, you know. The way he stared made you uncomfortable. Detective Chen felt electricity run through her. Do you know what happened to him? Did he move away? Margaret Torres frowned, thinking hard. I remember hearing that he moved downstate somewhere, maybe around 1981 or 1982. Someone said he bought a little place out in the country, wanted to be left alone. But I don't know where exactly. We weren't close. Nobody was close with him. The investigation narrowed to rural properties purchased in Michigan between 1981 and 1983. There were thousands of possibilities. Chen and her team cross-referenced property records with the employment history they had constructed for Thomas Whitaker, looking for geographic overlaps, looking for any hint of where he might have gone. After weeks of searching, they found a property deed filed in Gratiot County in February 1982. The buyer was listed as T. Whitaker, purchasing 8 acres of wooded land with a small cabin for $32,000. Paid in cash. The property sat at the end of a dirt road, miles from the nearest town, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. Detective Chen led a team of 6 officers to the property on November 3rd, 2022, 42 years and 10 months after Michael and Linda Reeves were murdered. They drove down that rutted dirt road through bare trees and cold Michigan wind, not knowing if they would find an occupied cabin or an abandoned ruin, not knowing if Thomas Whitaker was still alive or if they were chasing a ghost. The cabin stood at the end of the road. Smoke rising from its chimney, an old pickup truck parked beside it. Detective Chen approached with her weapon drawn, calling out, identifying herself. The front door opened slowly, and an elderly man stepped onto the porch. Thomas Whitaker was 84 years old, bent with age, his hair white and thin, his hands gnarled with arthritis. He looked at the police officers surrounding his cabin and smiled sadly, like he had been expecting this moment for decades. "You found me," he said quietly. I wondered how long it would take. Detective Chen read him his rights, while other officers secured the cabin. Inside, they found a shrine to Linda Morrison. Photographs covered the walls, dozens of them, some dating back to the 1950s when Linda was still in high school. Articles about her marriage to Michael Reeves. Newspaper clippings about the murders. A journal filled with handwritten entries describing his obsession, his rage, his careful planning of revenge against the woman who had rejected him and the man who had claimed her. But then came the confession that changed everything one final time. Thomas Whitaker admitted to planning the murders. He had followed Linda to Michigan in 1960, watching her from a distance for 20 years, seeing her build a life with Michael Reeves, a life that should have been his. He admitted to taking the maintenance job at the group home under a false identity, befriending James Brennan, recognizing in him the perfect tool, someone whose mental illness made him vulnerable to manipulation and whose presence at the crime scene would confuse investigators. He had picked up James on Christmas Eve, driven him to Maple Ridge Drive, and together they had entered the Reeves house through the back door, which Whitaker had unlocked weeks earlier during a daytime visit, posing as a furnace inspector. He'd given James a knife and told him they were going to scare some bad people, that it was a game, that everything would be fine. But then Whitaker admitted something that made Detective Chen's blood run cold. "I didn't expect James to actually stab anyone," Whitaker said. "I gave him the knife to make him feel involved, to keep him compliant. I was going to do it myself. But when Michael confronted us, James panicked. He lashed out. He stabbed Michael 3 times before I could stop him. And then Linda came running, and James went after her too. I tried to pull him back, but he was in some kind of frenzy. When it was over, I was horrified. This wasn't how I planned it." He had taken Linda's ring as a trophy, given it to James as a reward to keep him quiet, and driven him back to the group home. He had expected James to remain silent, protected by his mental illness, never imagining that Carol Brennan would find the ring and bring it to police. When he learned about the investigation closing in on James, Whitaker quit his fake maintenance job and disappeared to his cabin in Gratiot County, where he had lived in isolation for 4 decades, convinced that he had escaped justice. But then Detective Chen asked the question that had haunted this case since 1980. Why Linda's ring? Why not take anything valuable? Whitaker looked at her with watery eyes and said something that captured the twisted logic of obsession. "I wanted something she wore every day, something that touched her skin. I wanted proof that I had finally reached her, that even though she tried to escape me, I was always there, always watching, always waiting." Thomas Whitaker was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in March 2023, 43 years after the Christmas Eve murders that shattered Havenbrook's sense of safety. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. DNA from the jacket fabric, his detailed confession, the journal documenting decades of obsession, testimony from genetic genealogists explaining how modern science had tracked him down. The defense argued that James Brennan, not Whitaker, had been the primary aggressor, that Whitaker had only intended to frighten the Reeves family, not kill them. But then prosecutors presented forensic evidence showing that the knife wounds on Michael and Linda had been delivered with different levels of force and precision, suggesting 2 attackers working in coordination, not one confused man acting alone. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on both counts. Thomas Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He died 8 months later from complications related to advanced age and declining health, never expressing remorse for destroying the lives of 2 innocent people whose only crime was building the kind of happiness he felt entitled to possess. Detective Sarah Chen stood at Michael and Linda Reeves's grave on Christmas Eve 2023, 43 years to the day after their murders. Snow fell softly across the cemetery, coating headstones in fresh white, making everything look clean and new. She placed 2 red roses on their shared grave marker and stood there for a long time, thinking about justice delayed but not denied, thinking about the long arc of investigation that had finally bent toward truth. The story of the Reeves murders became a case study in how genetic genealogy could solve crimes that seemed impossible, how modern technology combined with determined detective work could reach back through decades and pull killers out of hiding. But for the people of Havenbrook, for the neighbors who had lived with unanswered questions for over 40 years, the resolution brought complicated emotions. Relief that the killer had finally been caught, anger that he had lived free for so long while Michael and Linda lay cold in the ground. Sadness for James Brennan, manipulated and used, dying in a psychiatric facility without ever fully understanding what he had done. And underneath it all, the persistent question that no trial verdict could answer. How do you rebuild trust in a world where obsession can fester for decades? Where Christmas Eve can turn into a nightmare? Where the people who seem most ordinary might be hiding the darkest intentions? Havenbrook still celebrates Christmas every year. Lights still go up on Maple Ridge Drive, though the house where Michael and Linda Reeves died has changed hands multiple times. Occupied now by a young family with 2 children who play in the yard where police cars once gathered. Most current residents don't know the history, don't realize they're living in proximity to tragedy. But older residents remember. They remember the fear that gripped the town in January 1981. The suspicion that settled over every interaction, the way people started locking their doors and watching their neighbors with new wariness. They remember the hope that flickered and died repeatedly over 40 years of dead ends and false leads. And they remember the strange mixture of emotions that came with Thomas Whitaker's arrest. The sense that justice had arrived too late to undo the damage, too late to restore what had been stolen on that snowy Christmas Eve in 1980. Detective Sarah Chen retired in 2024, her career bookended by the Reeves case, the investigation that had defined her work in the cold case unit. She gave one final interview before leaving the force. Sitting in the same office where Detective Raymond Krause had once studied crime scene photos and wrestled with impossible questions. "Cases like this teach you that truth has no statute of limitations," she said. "Evil doesn't expire just because time passes. And somewhere out there, in every unsolved murder, there's evidence waiting for the right technology, the right detective, the right moment when everything finally aligns." Michael and Linda Reeves waited 43 years for that moment. Other victims are still waiting. But as long as investigators keep pushing, keep searching, keep believing that answers exist, justice remains possible. The Christmas lights still shine in Havenbrook every December. Children still make wish lists and leave cookies for Santa. Families still gather around dinner tables and exchange gifts and pretend that the world is safe and predictable. But anyone who remembers 1980 knows better. They know that horror can arrive on the holiest of nights, that obsession can burn for decades without dimming, that the person sitting beside you might be hiding intentions so dark they don't reveal themselves until it's far too late. And every Christmas Eve, a few older residents of Havenbrook lock their doors a little earlier, check their windows a little more carefully, and think about Michael and Linda Reeves, whose only crime was being kind enough to let someone close, whose only mistake was believing that monsters announce themselves before they strike. The case is closed now, officially solved, filed away in archives where it joins thousands of other stories of violence and investigation and eventual justice. But the questions linger. The what-ifs circle endlessly. What if Linda had reported Thomas Whitaker's obsession more aggressive? Do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do.